Welcome, dear students, to this class on metaphysical poets. Metaphysical poets are a group of poets whose literary auras spread across the Caroline Age, Puritan Age, and Restoration period. They didn't call themselves metaphysical poets, but it was Samuel Johnson who called them metaphysical poets in his work Life of Cowley, but in a very disapproving way. Even John Dryden later on disapproved of this school of poets who belonged to the mid-17th century, but they became popular and they gained importance with T.S. Eliot's essay Metaphysical Poets and also with new critics. These poets, they wrote about love, romance, beauty, imagination, their relationship with God in a very peculiar way. Using peculiar images, far-fetched images, especially metaphysical conceits.
Metaphysical poetry is marked by bold and ingenious conceits, metaphors, drawing something forced parallels between apparently dissimilar ideas or things, frequent use of paradox, etc. Metaphysical poetry is concerned with the whole experience of man, especially about love, romantic and sensual, about man's relationship with God, the eternal perspective, and to a less extent about pleasure, learning, and art. Metaphysical means dealing with the relationship between spirit to matter or the ultimate nature of reality. Metaphysical poems are lyric poems. They are brief but intense meditations characterized by striking use of wit, irony, and wordplay. Beneath the formal structure of rhyme, meter, and stanza is the underlying structure of the poem's argument. Let's see the main features of metaphysical poetry. The metaphysical poems have been written following some chief characteristics such as the use of ordinary speech mixed with puns, paradoxes, and conceits. A paradoxical metaphor causing a shock to the reader by the strangeness of the objects compared. That's called a metaphysical conceit. For example, in one of the poems by John Dunn, the lovers are compared to a compass, the soul and temper, the body and the mind, and so on. We find very strange comparisons. Another feature is the exaltation of wit, which in the 17th century meant a nimbleness of thought, a sense of fancy, and originality in figures of speech. Abstruse terminology, often drawn from science or law. Often poems are presented in the form of an argument. In most of the poems by John Donne, we find a very strong arguments running throughout the poem. In love poetry, the metaphysical poets often draw on ideas from Renaissance Neoplatonism to show the relationship between the soul and the body and the union of lovers' souls. They also try to show a psychological realism when describing the tensions or conflicts in love. These poems are full of obscurity, which means confusion and haziness for the common reader.
The important metaphysical poets are John Donne, Henry Vaughan, Abraham Cowley, Andrew Marvell, Richard Crashow, and so on.
John Donne was a metaphysical lyrical poet famous for his use of metaphysical conceit, a strange and interesting comparison between two subjects when they, in fact, have very little in common at all. And these comparisons are so outrageous that in doing so, Dunn's poetry could almost be considered metaphysical humor. A classic example of Dunn's work, The Flea, shares much of the style and banter of Song Go and Catch a Falling Star. In The Flea, Dunn attempts to persuade a woman to make love with him by describing a bedbug that had bitten them both and then comparing that insect to a wedding bed. In Dunn's argument, because their blood was consequently mingling within the insect, in the tummy of the insect, was that they were already unified in a symbolic sanguine marriage. And so the physical act of love between them now would be of little consequence to the woman's principles. The same sense of humor, the one that made John Donne such a historical poet, is what a reader would find in Donne's another poem, Song Go and Catch a Falling Star. Donne is a poet of peculiar conceits, having his own way of reasoning and comparison. In his poetry, sensuality is blended with philosophy, passion with intellect, and contraries are ever moving one into the other. But Donne is not only an analytical sensualist. His later poems, as holy sonnets, are also touched with profound religious thoughts. Donne is considered the master of metaphysical poetry. Yet another poet is George Herbert, the saint of the metaphysical school, was a devout Anglican clergyman who believed that a poet should sing the glory of God. He describes his joys, fears, and doubts in a symbolic way. Many of his poems are overloaded with far-fetched conceits, too obscure to be appreciated. Herbert's poems are characterized by a precision of language, a metrical versatility, and an ingenious use of imagery or conceits that was favored by the metaphysical school of poets. Herbert's distinguishing characteristic is his simplicity of diction and metaphor. He retains the colloquial manner and, to an extent, the logical, persuasive presentation of ideas, but he draws his metaphors from everyday domestic experience, employing a range of simple commonplace imagery in contrast to the sophisticated imagery of Donne. A technique Herbert introduced was the ending of a poem with two quiet lines which resolve the argument in the poem without answering the specific points raised by it. Herbert occasionally explores his doubts in intellectual terms but answers them with emotion. Herbert's poetry is certainly about struggles of a religious kind. In these respects, Herbert can be considered to have broken new ground into which Henry Vaughan followed later. Henry Vaughan is considered as one of the major metaphysical poets whose works ponder one's personal relationship with God. He shares Herbert's preoccupation with the relationship between humanity and God, and he saw mankind as restless and constantly seeking a sense of harmony and fulfillment through contact with God. Vaughan, in contrast, has the arrogance of a visionary. He feels humility before God and Jesus, but seems to despise humanity. In contrast, Vaughan's images are more universal or cosmic, even to the point of judging man in relation to infinity. The term visionary is appropriate to Vaughan, not only because of the grand scale of his images, but also because his metaphors frequently draw on the sense of vision. Andrew Marvell is yet another metaphysical poet. He was a Puritan who served as Milton's assistant in the Commonwealth. He read in nature's mystic book and wrote poems on nature. But the haunting awareness of mortality, as shown in Donne's religious poems, also finds expression in Marvell's poems like To His Coy Mistress. He was gifted with a most subtle and introspective imagination. His technique of drawing upon philosophy to illustrate his argument gives the poem an intellectual appeal, not just a visual one. In Marvel, we find the presence of passion used as a peg on which to hang serious reflections on the brevity of happiness. Another metaphysical poet is Richard Crashow, who wrote many metaphysical poems following Dunn. Though his verse is somewhat uneven in quality, at its best it is characterized by brilliant use of extravagant baroque imagery. Crashaw owed all the pieces of his style, as he has been already hinted, to Dunn. His originality was one of the treatment and technique he forged a more rapid and brilliant short line than any of his predecessors had done, and for brief intervals and along sudden paths of his own, he carried English prosody to a higher refinement, a more glittering felicity than it had ever achieved. Thus, in spite of his conceits and his romantic coloring, he points the way for Pope, who did not disdain to borrow from him freely.
Metaphysical poets created a new trend in the history of English literature. They made use of everyday speech, intellectual analysis, and unique imagery. And they secured a lasting place in the history of English literature for its unique versatility. If you have any doubts regarding these metaphysical poets, you can WhatsApp me, or you can post your doubts in Google Classroom, or you can post it in the comment box below. Thank you.